Welcome to Educate, Inform, and Challenge. My name is Teresa McLennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. The goal of this program is to learn and share about the experiences of women and young girls and talk about violence against women, opportunities for women in leadership and decision-making, gender equity, and really about the lives of women from all aspects of our city. And before we begin, we want to thank our Indigenous people for allowing us to share this space with them, allowing us to have these conversations, to learn and to grow as individuals and as a community. And so today I am thrilled to welcome Sarah to our show. And Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Mm-hmm. Hi, everybody. Bonjour, Anine. My name is Sarah Cunningham. I am the Women's Advocacy Council Project Coordinator for the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. I am First Nation, from Rama First Nation. I'm going to just introduce myself. Gahandi Kwe Shishiwabek Ndijnakaz Makwadodam Ramadonjnaba. My spirit name is Gahandi Kwe Shishiwabek, means Red Earth Woman. It was gifted to me when I was 18 years old. And when we talk about our spirit names, it's about our roles and responsibilities throughout our lifetime. And when we are gifted our names, it's also from the community. The community is there to also witness our names. And with that, to also have them help us about remembering our roles and our responsibilities with that name. I'm also Bear Clan. I am a Mama Bear at heart, that's for sure. And that's my clan. And I'm also from Rama First Nation. That's the territory of my ancestors and family. And that's where I am filming today.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think that this is the wonderful part about being able to have these conversations. There's so much learning that we as a community can do. And I think that even just sharing that history and putting it into context is so enlightening and educational for all of us. So thank you so much for that. So I want to dive in today and talk about National Indigenous History Month, which is in June. So can you help us to understand why is that an important time for us to remember that date?
Mm-hmm. With every month, whether it's Black History Month, Indigenous History Month, it's really important because at first we had one day, which was June 21st. And June 21st is our summer solstice. That is a time to celebrate, to trade with our communities and with other nations from across Turtle Island. So it was a time of celebration and a time of growth, right? Because when we think about what's happening in June, we have all of this plentiful bounty of nourishments that are happening. Our food is growing, and that the waters come alive that nourish our bodies and our spirits. And so with June, that us being, it's our, summer solstice, but it's really important in terms of the history. And it's not taught in school, at elementary. It's starting to slowly come along in terms of some of that history and the importance of history, because we need to know where we're from, where we've come from, the policies, legislation, and that has really formed many communities. And that's the importance of our Indigenous History Month, but also to celebrate and to share knowledge in terms of some of our cultural teachings, our food, land, and that. So it's a time to really celebrate, but it's also a time to really explore our policies, procedures, what has governed Indigenous communities within the colonial Western society but also traditionally, how we are as Indigenous nation across Turtle Island, how we are reclaiming our language, reclaiming the teachings, reclaiming ceremony. So it's a really amazing time in June to be able to share with one another and to reach out, and it's a time to teach as well.
So I mean, we only have a half an hour, today, and it's such a important and critical conversations that need to happen and continue to happen. And I know I'm going to ask you a very large question right now, but help us to understand from a historical perspective the experiences of Indigenous communities.
The experience, that's a very large question. The experience, resilience, the strength within the community, and that being an Indigenous woman here in Canada, how so much of the historical pieces, whether it's the Indian Act, how the Indian Act legislation has really formed our communities, and that experience is beautiful, can be more beautiful. However, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma that has impacted a large proportion of Indigenous communities. The Indian Act, as I mentioned, I do honestly still believe that everybody should really take a look at what that is. Take a look and read it. When it was first introduced in 1857 was the Gradual Civilization Act. That's what it was called. And so through that, it was actually to assimilate at that time. I'm going to use the word Indian because that's the terms that were being used back then. And it's really important, especially if you're a youth or an adult, if you're really wanting to look at documentation. So back then, the term Indian was being used. And so I'll use that in terms of when we're talking about the Indian Act. But the Gradual Civilization Act was really about the assimilation of Indian people into Canadian settler society. And so they were really encouraging the Indigenous people to voluntarily to enfranchise with the settlers that were settling here in Canada at the time. And then the federal government, which we now know today, back in 1869. So this is well over 100 years, centuries worth of acts and legislation. And so the federal government created the Gradual Enfranchisement Act. And that was at that time really established the councils, the systems that we know, elective systems of our chief and councillors here today. So imposing how to vote. We had our own clan systems in place and how to run our own communities. However, the government back then had imposed band council elections and who could and could not. Women could not run in council. They couldn't even vote. They couldn't even vote in their own community until the 1950s, 60s. Indigenous women were not allowed to even vote in the federal or provincial elections until 1960. Every other woman in this country was able to vote. Indigenous women were not allowed to vote. We were the last ones to be able to vote as women here in this country. And we were the original people. So when you take a look at the Indian Act, it has had quite a bit of effect on the lives of the community, and especially our women, because our women in our communities, they're the hearts, they're the life givers. They are the ones that would distribute everything to the community, food, the clothing, and anything access from the community that would go up to trade with other community and also with the settlers. So it was really, the community was, it was ran by women, the grandmothers, the clan mothers. So
It's such an incredible history and journey, you know, to learn more about that movement that has happened for Indigenous communities and people. And we are going to be heading into a short break, but I want to circle back to this conversation, and I want to start to unpack talking about oppression and barriers. And I'd also like to talk about what your thoughts are about what that looked like more so, you know, years ago, but also what does that look like now? And are the Indigenous communities, women in particular, still facing those same or different oppressions and systemic barriers? So when we return, we will circle back to this conversation. Please stay with us. Welcome back, and we are talking with Sarah Cunningham, who is the Women's Advocacy Council Coordinator for the Women and Children's Shelter of Barrie. And today we are having this most incredible conversation of learning about, you know, the movement and the history of Indigenous people. And June is National Indigenous History Month. And so it is vitally important that we recognize that month, but we continue on conversations so that we can learn from that history and we can change what needs to be changed in all of us. And so welcome back, Sarah. And, you know, I want to pick up where we left off. And I want to ask you this very large question again. Talk to us about, from a historical perspective, oppression of Indigenous people from long ago, and also put it into the context of today and what is happening today.
The oppression in terms of Indigenous communities have faced, you know, it really started a couple hundred years ago, over 500 years ago, when the oppression and that started happening. But I just want to kind of touch base maybe over the last couple hundred years. And part of the oppression, you know, it really started in terms of a lot of the legislation, a lot of policies that were in place. We talked a little bit about the Indian Act, but then there was also, and some people have heard the terms, residential school. So here in Canada, we called it residential school. In the US, because it was taking place in the US, they were called industrial schools. So those started back in the late 1800s. And what was happening was part of the assimilation that was happening we talked a little bit about the Gradual Civilization Act. And so really it was about the assimilation of the Indians into Western society. And there are some great quotes. I'm not going to quote John A. Macdonald right now, but there are some quotes, you know, from those past leaders in terms of really talking about the assimilation, needing to assimilate the Indians. And so they had created these residential schools, taking the children from 3 years old up until, you know, they could be 18 years old, taking them from the communities. And they were largely ran by the church, the states of the church. And so the children were taken from their communities to be schooled, to learn how to cook, how to sew, how to speak English. And they were forced to speak English. There's a lot of history, a lot of people remembering that if they couldn't speak their own language. And how, you know, sometimes I take a look or think about how difficult that must have been for them not to be able to speak their language, going into a place and not understanding these adults figures, and they would be disciplined if they spoke their language. My grandmother is a residential school survivor. The stories that she had shared with me, we had finally found each other when I was in my late 20s. And the effects that it does have on the family, and even within my own personal experience, we had 4 generations of women not raised by their family and or community. My son is the 5th generation. He's finally knows where he's from. He's speaking his language. He's knowing his culture. And that, so there's a lot of history in terms of the oppression. So a lot of it has, systematically happened during those residential school era. So many children were misplaced. And, I am very fortunate to be even sitting here having this conversation with you. Many of those children didn't make it home. A lot of those residential schools, there are graveyards in behind of little children, of babies. So why were the babies there? A lot of people ask that question. So there's that part of our history, and trying to come to terms in what that means within our own society, as well as, and then, the residential schools. So not being raised by your mom and dad and coming back into the community. And then what had occurred was the 60 scoop. And even though my grandmother had some really beautiful children, my aunties and uncles, they were taken from her for no reasons. At that time, once again, the Church of the States were coming in, taking the children and adopting them out to other homes. My aunt actually still has a receipt for her adoption, $5 she was bought for, and placed into a white family. So again, no culture, no language, in that within her own family, and being displaced with no other siblings. So that continued to happen even after the residential school. And so the last residential school, we think that this is so far ago, so long ago. Actually, the last residential school that had actually closed was in 1996 at the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan. So it's fairly recent in the history. And, that was even after I was born. I'm not going to try to date myself, but it was after I was born. And so there's still people that are living and walking that have that experience of residential school. And so even after that, we have our 60 scoop babies. And so it has been more in the news the last couple of years because of the class action, and also having the government and the churches and trying to reconcile how policies and procedures and legislation have really affected the communities. So with that oppression of taking away family, culture, language, and community. And it's so important for us to really understand that part of the history because of that intergenerational trauma. And so when we see it today, what does that look like? We're seeing the effects of intergenerational trauma effects, not being raised. We still have many communities members that are still trying to find their family and their communities. It took me a couple of decades to find where my family is, to have that relationship. I was the tail end of the 60 scoop, being able to try to find and connect with my biological mother, not just my mother, but my aunts and uncles and my grandmother. But it took us 4 generations to find one another. But the beauty of the internet, where we are now today, to be able to connect and reconnect to community, it is a blessing. And for us to be able to know what has happened So there's that understanding. And when we have understanding, not just with not just Indigenous people, but everybody, when we have an understanding of each other's history, we can better understand one another, to be kind, to be respectful. And it's really important to gain that knowledge so that history doesn't repeat itself.
Sarah, I just have to thank you because for myself personally, and I know for our viewers who are watching right now, there's just an incredible amount of learning that's happening. And I think self-reflection. And I think that the conversation is good because it will hopefully spark in so many people to reflect on that history and the importance of that history, the celebration of that history, even as non-Indigenous people, to celebrate Indigenous peoples. And so I'm just really, truly overwhelmed by the beauty of the history that you're sharing with all of us today. And there is so much that I want to talk to you about. And so I think, we are going to continue on our conversations, but I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about, you mentioned reconciliation. Talk to us about truth and reconciliation and what that looks like.
Truth and reconciliation. We know that there is that report out there. There was the 94 calls to action. So far, 10 of them are completed. At this pace, so it's been 6 years since the Truth and Reconciliation. So at that pace, we've completed 10 of them. So that's 2 per year. So by the time it's completed, it's going to be 2062. So they're definitely, I encourage everyone to kind of really take a look. But for me, when that came out, and I had a lot of discussions with family and friends. And what does that look like to me, for me, in my family, in my community? And truth and reconciliation, for me, it's when we know where we're from. It is when we have our language back, we're fluent again. When it's okay to have ceremony openly, to be able to have ceremony openly. And to also be welcomed in spaces, and especially within the government's corporate educational systems, and even just to build space, right? And because even say, we'll take an example, educational spaces, college, universities, students, or even at the hospital. The importance of collaboration with Indigenous partners, and especially when there's new builds happening. What does that look like? How can we facilitate our own, even in the healthcare system, right? Our own health, because part of our health is the ceremonies and our natural medicines as well. So to be able to have a space where healing can actually take place, because, when if you think of the hospital, even life begins there and also ends there at times. And so having that, even a space to have a fire, even to be able to have an actual fire, to feed those spirits, welcoming those spirits into this new life or exiting into life. So I think it's really important, what that reconciliation. So it is really partnering with your Indigenous communities and to even be able to have a physical space. And what does that look like? And to dream together, because when we dream together and we envision a future together, it truly is together that we can have and create this beautiful life for one another and with one another. And we have many communities out here in Georgian Bay and Simcoe County that there is that process, and Indigenous communities that we can partner with to create space and for us to dream together in a kind way, and for us to complete, the truth and reconciliation.
Yeah. Sarah, thank you so much for really just the beginning of our conversations, right? And there's so much that I want to be able to dive in deeper, the next time that you and I are talking. If we have some folks who are listening today and they want to learn more, is there any resources or, sites that you could direct them to where they could read more, learn more? Where would you direct folks to go?
I think one of the best, it's about 800 pages and counting, is the Inquiry of the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. That has a great overview of history there, but it also, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about our murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, but it gives a really good overview of history, and what that looks like, and the traditional roles of our Indigenous women and our girls. So I really encourage people to take a look at that, and I'm sure we'll post the websites. Also, there are some resources at our website too, at berryshelter.com/WAC. There's also the Truth and Reconciliation. Definitely take a look at the calls to actions there. And I really do encourage people to really read the Indian Act.
That is a wonderful list of resources for all of us. And so we really hope that for our viewers today that you have received some education, that you've been informed, and that this conversation has challenged our thinking and what we believe to be true. And so take the knowledge that you've learned today and share that with others. And I think, it's been a wonderful conversation with Sarah because it speaks to the importance of having open and honest dialogue and transparency in the history and the experiences of Indigenous people, and that us as communities, we need to learn and we need to know more so that we can celebrate this land, celebrate the people who were here before us. And so thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing this space with us today. And we just really appreciate the learning, and we thank our viewers for being with us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation and definitely talking more about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Stay tuned, and thank you so much for being with us here today.